Jaron Cross had been stepping over corpses for 3 hours when he started making a list of things he'd rather be doing. The list was getting pretty elaborate. Root canal surgery without anesthetic, attending his ex-wife's wedding, explaining to his mother why he hadn't called in 6 months. Literally anything except trudging through the aftermath on Kepler 442b, a planet that smelled like someone had set a circuit board on fire and then tried to put it out with blood. The dust here was the worst part. Red-orange, fine as powder, it got into everything. His boots, his eyes, the back of his throat where it sat like regret mixed with copper filings. He'd read somewhere that this planet had once been considered prime real estate for colonization. Earth-like gravity, breathable atmosphere, plenty of water. That was before both sides decided it made an excellent place to kill each other in bulk. Now it was just another rock with too many ghosts and not enough reasons to remember their names. His scanner beeped, marking another human casualty. Private Chen, according to the ID chip still faithfully broadcasting from what remained of her torso. Jaron tagged the location, added her to the list, moved on. Standard post-battle protocol for a combat medic who'd arrived 3 hours too late to do anything except count the dead and pretend it mattered. The battlefield stretched out for kilometers in every direction. A graveyard of twisted metal and biological matter that used to be people with families and bad habits and favorite foods. Destroyed tanks squatted like dead beetles. A human gunship lay on its side, nose buried in the orange dirt, its hull peeled open like someone had used a very large, very angry can opener. Further out, he could see the wreckage of an Azurian warstrider, its elegant legs crumpled beneath it, the crystalline cockpit shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces that caught the setting sun. Jaron paused to drink from his canteen, the water tasting like the purification tablets they'd used to treat it, like drinking liquid disappointment. He was calculating whether he had enough energy bars to make it back to base camp when his scanner picked up something odd. A bio sign, faint but definitely there. He checked the readout twice, certain it had to be a malfunction. Nothing should be alive out here. Nothing had been alive out here for hours. He followed the signal through a maze of debris, climbing over a collapsed defense pylon that had crushed whatever poor bastards had been standing beneath it when it fell. That's when he saw her. Blue skin. That was the first thing his brain registered. The kind of blue you'd see in a tropical ocean on Earth, if Earth still had tropical oceans that weren't filled with plastic and regret. She was half buried beneath twisted metal, golden hair matted with dust and something darker. Her armor, what remained of it, was the ceremonial style of the Azurian Legion, which meant she'd probably been an officer. Her ears, long and swept back like something out of ancient human mythology, were torn on one side, the delicate cartilage shredded. The second thing his brain registered was the wound. Plasma burns across her torso, the kind that cooked you from the inside out. And her spine, he could see where the superheated projectile had punched through between her shoulder blades, the cauterized entry wound still smoking slightly in the cooling air. She shouldn't be alive. Every piece of medical training Jaron had insisted this wasn't possible. The spinal damage alone should have killed her in minutes, nervous system shutting down like someone pulling the plug on a machine. But her chest was rising and falling shallow breaths that moved the dust on her lips, and her eyes, amber shot through with gold, like honey held up to sunlight, tracked him as he approached. Those eyes held a lot of things. Pain, obviously. Fury, the specific kind of rage that comes from betrayal rather than simple defeat. And underneath it all, something that looked almost like relief. Like she'd been waiting for death to arrive, and here it was, wearing dusty human fatigues and carrying a medkit that smelled like antiseptic and broken promises. Jaron knelt beside her, his knees cracking in a way that made him feel every one of his 34 years. His scanner confirmed what his eyes were seeing: catastrophic spinal trauma, severe plasma burns, internal bleeding that should have killed her twice over. The readout gave her maybe 20 minutes, and that was generous. Well, he said, more to himself than to her. This is inconvenient. She made a sound, something between a laugh and a groan. When she spoke, her voice was rough, each word clearly costing her. Human, you are lost. Story of my life, Jaren muttered, already pulling out his medical scanner for a more detailed readout. Though usually I'm not this lost. The protocol was clear. Enemy combatants were to be reported to command and left for their own retrieval teams. Field Regulation 742, subsection D, which Jaren could recite in his sleep because he'd written reports about it after finding wounded Azurians 3 times before. He'd followed protocol those 3 times. Tagged them, reported their positions, moved on. Never looked back to see if their people actually came for them. He was looking at the scanner data, at the impossibility of her still breathing when she spoke again. Leave me your duty. Yeah, I know my duty, Jaren said. I've got it memorized. Hell, I've got it tattooed on my ass, metaphorically speaking. He looked at the setting sun, then at his scanner, then at the distant ruins his equipment had flagged earlier. Some kind of temple complex, predating both human and Azurian arrival on this rock. About 3 kilometers northeast, mostly intact according to the structural scan. Shelter. Maybe even defensible shelter, if he was very lucky and also very stupid. He thought about Field Regulation 742. Subsection D, he thought about Lieutenant Graves and the village on Tau Ceti E, and the report that had disappeared into bureaucratic darkness. He thought about how his ex-wife used to say he had a problem with authority, and how she'd meant it as an insult, but maybe she'd just been more perceptive than he'd given her credit for. Here's the thing, Jaren said, checking his supplies and doing math he definitely shouldn't be doing. I'm having a really bad day. Like, top 10 worst days of my life, and I once watched a shuttle crash with my entire unit inside. So I'm going to make a terrible decision, because at least terrible decisions are interesting, and I could use interesting right about now. He started clearing debris from around her, his back already protesting the effort. She watched him with those amber eyes, confusion joining the pain and fury. You cannot, she managed. I am enemy. Yeah, I noticed the blue skin and the ears, Jaren said, grunting as he shoved aside a piece of hull plating. Real subtle, your people, very incognito. The temple was older than both their wars, and it showed. Jaren had dragged Sylveth through 3 kilometers of hell to reach it, and now that he was inside, he could see that the building itself had opinions about structural integrity that differed significantly from his own. Parts of the ceiling had given up entirely, creating shafts of light that moved across the floor like prison searchlights operated by someone with attention deficit disorder. The walls were covered in symbols that weren't human and definitely weren't Azurian. Something else had been here first, had carved their entire philosophy or grocery list or whatever into the stone, and then had the good sense to leave before humanity and the Azurian Legion showed up to ruin the neighborhood. He'd set up in what his scanner optimistically labeled a meditation chamber, though it looked more like a room where someone had meditated so hard they'd made part of the roof collapse from the sheer force of their introspection. Jaren had used rubble to barricade the main entrance, which meant anyone wanting to get in would have to either move several tons of carved stone or use the back entrance he'd found, which involved crawling through a gap that smelled like something had died in there and then been reincarnated just to die again. His military tarp was stretched across the cleanest section of floor, creating what he generously called a sterile field, though it was about as sterile as a subway station during flu season. Sylveth lay on it, still paralyzed from the neck down, still alive in a way that made Jaren's medical training have a small existential crisis every time he checked her vitals. So, Jaren said, unpacking his medkit for the 3rd time because organization was the only thing keeping him from acknowledging the full weight of what he'd just done. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the pain? And before you answer, know that I'm working with human painkillers here, which I'm not even sure won't just poison you. I didn't really cover Azurian pharmacology in med school. mostly because I didn't go to med school. I went to combat medic training, which is like med school if med school was 3 months long and taught by people who thought, just apply pressure, was a complete treatment philosophy. Sylveth's eyes tracked him as he moved around the chamber. She'd been silent for most of the journey here, probably because being dragged across 3 kilometers of broken terrain while paralyzed didn't leave much energy for conversation. But now she spoke, her voice still rough but stronger than before. 8, she said. Perhaps 9, your measurement scale is unclear. Yeah, pain scales are subjective, Jaren agreed, pulling out his scanner. One person's 8 is another person's 3. My ex-wife once gave birth a rating of 6, then gave me leaving the toilet seat up a rating of 9, so I've learned not to trust the system. He ran the scanner over her spine, watching the readout paint a picture of damage that should have killed her 3 times over. The plasma burn had essentially cooked her spinal cord, severing neural connections that in any sane universe couldn't be repaired without surgery, so advanced it might as well be magic. But the scanner was also showing something else, something his database flagged with a little question mark icon that he was pretty sure meant the scanner itself was confused. Your nervous system is trying to rebuild itself, Jaren said, staring at the readout. That's not possible. That's not how nervous systems work. I would know. I failed the neurology section of my certification twice. Azurian physiology, Sylveth said, and even paralyzed and dying she managed to sound slightly superior about it. We are adaptive. Under extreme trauma our bodies attempt regeneration. It is rarely successful. Usually we die before completion. Well, that's cheerful, Jaren muttered. How long does this regeneration usually take? Months, if it works at all. She paused, and he could see her trying to move her fingers, the effort showing in her face but producing no results. Most die within weeks. Infection, complications. The regeneration is imperfect. Jaren looked at his supplies. He had maybe 2 weeks of medical material, and that was if he stretched it like a dollar store rubber band. After that, he'd have to raid the battlefield for more, picking through the dead like a vulture with a medkit and questionable life choices. Okay, he said, pulling out a plasma suture kit he'd taken from a dead Azurian soldier. I'm going to try to stabilize the burns. This is going to hurt, probably a lot. You might want to scream. I do not scream, Sylveth said, and there was enough pride in her voice that Jaren almost felt bad for what came next. The plasma suture kit was designed for Azurian tissue, which meant he didn't have to guess about compatibility. What he did have to guess about was technique, since his training in alien field surgery consisted of 1 lecture by an instructor who'd admitted halfway through that he was mostly making it up. Jaren activated the suture, watched it glow with contained energy, and pressed it against the burn running along her ribs. Sylveth screamed. It was a sound that started low in her chest and climbed up through octaves that Jaren hadn't known existed, a noise that made the ancient stones around them seem to sympathize. Her whole body went rigid, or the parts that could still move went rigid, which was basically just her head and neck, but she put a lot of effort into it. You said you don't scream, Jaren said, trying to keep his hand steady. I lied, she gasped out when she could breathe again. Deception is a warrior's tool. That's a very convenient philosophy. He moved to the next burn, smaller but deeper. This might be a good time to tell me your name, by the way. I've been mentally calling you Blue, which feels culturally insensitive. Sylveth, another scream as he applied the suture. Of the Azurian Legion, 3rd, Strike Division. Jaren Cross, human, professional bad decision maker. He finished with the suture and set it aside, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. There. The burns are sealed. You're probably going to live another few days, which means I have time to regret this spectacularly. They fell into silence, broken only by her ragged breathing. Outside, the sun had fully set, and the only light came from his portable lamp and the bioluminescent moss growing in the cracks of the ancient walls. The moss cast everything in a faint green glow that made the chamber look like the inside of an aquarium designed by someone with depression. "Why?" Sylveth asked finally. "You should have left me. Your people will consider this treason." Jaren was cleaning his equipment, arranging everything in neat rows because that's what you did when your brain needed something to control. "Yeah, probably. But here's the thing about treason. It only matters if someone finds out. And everyone thinks I'm tagging corpses on a dead battlefield. I've got at least a week before anyone notices I'm not where I'm supposed to be. And after a week, I'll worry about it. That's my other philosophy. Never worry about something until it's actively trying to kill you." He sat back against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "Besides, I left you 3 times before. Different battlefield, different wounded Azurians. Followed protocol, tagged them, moved on. You want to know how many of them got picked up by your people?" Sylveth didn't answer, but her silence was answer enough. "0, Jaren continued. "Your people left them there, just like mine would have left me if the situations were reversed. So maybe I'm tired of following protocols written by people who have never had to look someone in the eyes while they die alone. Maybe I'm just tired." He closed his eyes. "Or maybe I'm an idiot, probably that one." Progress came in measurements so small they might as well have been theoretical. On day 8, Sylveth's left index finger twitched. Jaren had been attempting to jury-rig a neural stimulator from 3 different pieces of salvaged equipment, 1 human, 2 Azurian, when he saw it. Just a tiny movement, barely enough to qualify as motion, but after a week of complete paralysis it might as well have been a marathon. "Did you just flip me off?" Jaren asked, looking up from his work. "I do not know this gesture," Sylveth said, staring at her hand with an intensity that could have bored holes through steel. "But if it expresses frustration with your primitive attempt at medical technology, then yes." "Primitive? I built this thing from spare parts and sheer audacity. This is engineering poetry." He held up what looked like a tangle of wires connected to a power cell that was definitely not rated for the voltage he was pushing through it. "Admittedly, it's bad poetry, the kind your drunk uncle recites at Thanksgiving, but it's poetry nonetheless." The neural stimulator was his latest project, cobbled together after spending 3 nights reading through medical databases on his datapad and making educated guesses about Azurian neurology. The theory was sound. Send carefully calibrated electrical pulses through her nervous system to encourage the regeneration her body was already attempting. The practice involved a lot of sparks, some concerning smells, and at least 2 small fires that Jaren had managed to extinguish before they became medium fires. He attached the leads to her spine, checking the readings on his scanner. "Okay, this is either going to help or turn you into a really attractive paperweight. I'd say the odds are 60-40. "Which direction?" "I'll tell you after we find out." He activated the device. Sylveth's entire body went rigid, her back arching off the tarp. For a horrible moment, Jaren thought he'd just electrocuted his patient, which would have been a disappointing end to 2 weeks of effort. Then she gasped, her chest heaving and her right hand clenched into a fist. "I felt that," she said, wonder creeping into her voice. "I felt my hand move." "Yeah, you're welcome. That'll be 1 functioning spine. Please leave payment at the front desk." Jaren was checking the readings, making sure he hadn't just accidentally cooked any important neural pathways. "We'll do this twice a day. Your nervous system is regenerating, but it's doing it like a drunk person trying to parallel park, technically moving in the right direction but really slowly and with a lot of corrections." They fell into a routine after that. Morning sessions with the neural stimulator, where Sylveth would spend an hour convincing her body to remember what movement felt like. Afternoons were for rest, which mostly meant Sylveth sleeping while Jaren made supply runs to the battlefield, scavenging medical equipment from corpses who definitely weren't using it anymore. Evenings were for the conversations that had started as necessity and evolved into something neither of them had expected. "Tell me about Earth," Sylveth said one night, After a particularly brutal therapy session that had left her exhausted and Jaren feeling like he just coached someone through climbing a mountain made of knives. Your homeworld, what is it like? Jaren was organizing his latest haul, 3 human medkits, 2 Azurian plasma sutures, and 1 mysterious device that might have been a medical scanner or possibly a toaster. The database wasn't clear. Wet, that's the main thing about Earth. So much water you can't throw a rock without hitting an ocean. I grew up on the coast, spent my whole childhood convinced I was going to be a marine biologist. What changed? I learned that marine biology involves a lot of math and not enough swimming with dolphins. Also, the dolphins were mostly dead by the time I was old enough to study them. Climate change, pollution, the usual apocalyptic checklist. He shrugged. So I joined the military instead, because if the planet was dying anyway, I might as well see some other planets before they died too. Sylveth made a sound that might have been Azurian laughter, a pessimistic philosophy. I prefer realistic. Although to be fair, most of the planets I've seen have been actively on fire, so my sample size might be skewed. He turned to look at her. What about Azure Prime? What's your homeworld like? Beautiful. The word came out soft, and for the first time since he'd found her, Sylveth's expression wasn't hard with pain or pride. We have floating gardens that drift through the upper atmosphere, held aloft by crystalline structures that sing in the wind. The entire planet rings like a bell during storm season. Our cities are grown, not built. We sing them into being over generations, shaping living crystal into spires that touch the clouds. That's significantly more poetic than wet, Jaren admitted. My description needs work. Your description is honest. That has value. The conversations continued, filling the temple's silence with stories of homes they might never see again. Jaren told her about his sister's terrible poetry, how she'd insisted on reciting it at every family gathering until their mother had actually paid her to stop. Sylveth described the taste of crystallized moonlight, a delicacy on Azure Prime made from some process Jaren couldn't quite understand, but that sounded like it involved a lot of waiting and possibly some singing. On day 15, Sylveth moved her toes. On day 18, she could curl her fingers into fists. On day 21, she managed to lift her right arm 3 centimeters off the ground before it collapsed back down, shaking with effort. I was a warrior, she said that night, frustration making her voice sharp. I commanded strike teams. I flew combat ships through plasma storms. Now I cannot even sit up without assistance. You were shot in the spine and left to die, Jaren pointed out, running another diagnostic. The fact that you can wiggle your toes is medically miraculous. Give yourself some credit. Credit is earned through achievement, not survival. That's a terrible philosophy. Who taught you that? Sylveth was quiet for a moment. My commander, before he ordered my execution. And there it was, the thing Jaren had been dancing around for 3 weeks. He'd seen the wound, seen where the plasma fire had entered her back at close range. That wasn't enemy fire. That was betrayal wearing friendly colors. You want to tell me about that? He asked, settling down against the wall. Or we can go back to talking about floating gardens and terrible poetry. She was silent for so long he thought she'd chosen the gardens. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. My commander received intelligence about a human colony. Military target, he said. Strategic value. He ordered an orbital strike. Her eyes fixed on the temple ceiling, where the bioluminescent moss cast shifting shadows. I reviewed the intelligence. I ran my own scans. It was not a military installation. It was civilian, families, children, the kind of target that wins battles but loses wars. So you refused. I refused to relay the firing coordinates. By Azurian military law, that is treason. By my own code, relaying those coordinates would have been murder. She tried to clench her fist and managed it barely. So they shot me. Not officially. The report will say I died honorably in combat. But my commander put the plasma round in my back himself, and my team left me on that battlefield to become another unfortunate casualty. Jaren absorbed this, feeling the familiar weight of understanding. I filed a report once about a lieutenant who ordered an artillery strike on a village, said it was harboring enemy troops. It wasn't. Just farmers who'd refused to relocate when we told them to. I filed the report through proper channels, included evidence, did everything by the book. What happened? The report disappeared. Lieutenant Graves got promoted. I got transferred to Corps Detail where I couldn't cause trouble. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out proper channels is just code for shut up and follow orders. Then we are both traitors to our causes. Or, Jaren said, we're the only ones who aren't. Sylveth stood for the first time on day 53, and it lasted exactly 7 seconds before her legs gave out, and she collapsed into Jaren like a falling tree. They both went down in a tangle of limbs, hitting the temple floor hard enough that Jaren's back made a noise that probably meant future chiropractic bills he couldn't afford. 7 seconds, he gasped from beneath her. That's a new record. The old record was 0 seconds, so statistically speaking, this is infinite improvement. Sylveth was laughing, which was a sound Jaren had never heard from her before. It started as a chuckle and built into something that shook her whole body, wild and uncontrolled. I fell on you. I can fall now. This is progress. Yeah, terrific progress. My crushed ribcage agrees. But he was laughing too, because 7 seconds was everything compared to nothing. Because after almost 2 months of watching her struggle to move individual fingers, seeing her actually stand, even briefly, felt like watching someone punch physics in the face. They tried again an hour later. This time she made it to 9 seconds before her knees buckled. By the end of the day, she'd managed 15 seconds of standing, leaning heavily against the temple wall but upright, vertical, defying the paralysis that should have been permanent. The physical therapy became the center of their days. Jaren had constructed a makeshift parallel bar from salvaged metal beams, creating a structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd seen pictures of proper medical equipment, but had been very drunk at the time. Sylveth would grip the bars and force her legs to remember walking, each step a negotiation between will and biology. You're putting too much weight on your left side, Jaren observed from where he sat cross-legged on the floor, watching her technique, compensating for the nerve damage in your right leg. Perhaps if your parallel bars were level, I would not need to compensate. Those bars are perfectly level. I measured them with my eyes and everything. He stood, moving to her side. Here, shift your weight like this. Pretend you're a tree in a windstorm, bend but don't break. Trees do not walk. Not with that attitude they don't. She managed 3 steps before her right leg locked up, muscles spasming. Jaren caught her before she could fall, taking her weight easily now. After 2 months of this, he'd learned exactly how to support her without making it seem like support, how to let her maintain the warrior's pride she clung to even as she relearned basic motor functions. I was Azurian Legion, she said later, during the rest period where she lay on the tarp and tried not to let frustration consume her. I could run for 50 kilometers in full combat gear. I once held a defensive position alone for 18 hours against a human assault team. Now I cannot walk to that wall without assistance. Yeah, but you're getting there. That's what matters. Jaren was running diagnostics, checking the neural regeneration rates. Your nervous system is rebuilding itself at a rate that's making my scanner question its understanding of biology. Give it time. Time is what we may not have. She turned her head to look at him. My people will be searching. Eventually they will find this temple. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. That's my specialty, dealing with problems exactly when they become unavoidable and not 1 second earlier. This is not a sound survival strategy. And yet I'm still alive, so clearly it works. The conversations had evolved beyond therapy and shared trauma into something Jaren couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't friendship exactly. You couldn't be friends with someone whose people were actively trying to kill your people. But it wasn't not friendship either. It existed in some undefined space where enemies could teach each other meditation techniques and argue about philosophy at 3 in the morning. Sylvath had taught him Azurian breathing exercises that helped with the nightmares he'd been having since Tau Ceti, the kind of nightmares where Lieutenant Graves kept getting promoted, and the village kept burning, and Jaren kept filing reports that disappeared into administrative darkness. Now when he woke up gasping, he could breathe through it, could find the calm center that Azurian warriors used before battle. In exchange, he'd introduced her to Earth music. His datapad had survived 2 years of combat with a library that ranged from classical to something he called Apocalypse Blues, music made by humans who'd watched their planet dying and decided to soundtrack it. Her long ears would twitch when she listened, processing frequencies humans couldn't quite catch. "This one sounds like sadness wearing sunglasses," she said, listening to a particularly melancholy guitar riff. "That's blues music. That's literally the entire genre. Why would anyone create art from sadness? Because sometimes sadness is all you've got and you might as well make it beautiful." He switched tracks. "Here, try this one. It's about a guy whose car broke down, his dog died, and his wife left him. But he's still got his guitar, so he figures he's doing okay. This is supposed to be encouraging. In a weird way, yeah." They argued about consciousness one night, about whether it required biology or could exist as pure energy. Sylvath's people believed in the crystalline collective, a theoretical state where individual consciousness could merge into a shared network maintained by the singing crystals of Azure Prime. Jaren thought it sounded like dying with extra steps and said so. "You fear losing individuality," Sylvath observed. "I fear a lot of things. That's on the list somewhere between spiders and running out of coffee." He was attempting to fix a tear in his uniform, though his stitching looked like it had been done by someone having a seizure. But yeah, the idea of dissolving into some collective consciousness doesn't appeal. "I like being me, even if me is a disaster making bad decisions in a temple on a dead planet." "You are not a disaster. I'm harboring an enemy soldier in violation of about 40 different military regulations. That's pretty much the definition of a disaster. You are a disaster who saved my life." She was watching him struggle with the needle, "and whose stitching is truly terrible, give me that. You can barely move your arms. But I can move them well enough to fix your incompetence." He handed her the needle and watched as she carefully worked the thread through the fabric, her movements slow but precise. Her fine motor control had been returning faster than her gross motor skills, something about how the neural regeneration prioritized different pathways. It meant she could hold a needle but still couldn't walk more than a few meters. "You know what's funny?" Jaren said, watching her work. 2 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in an ancient temple teaching an Azurian warrior about blues music while she fixed my uniform, I'd have checked them for head trauma. 2 months ago, I would have killed you on sight. Yeah, and I would have left you to die following proper protocol. Look at us now, growing as people." She finished the stitching and handed back the uniform. The repair was neat, professional, the kind of work that came from someone who'd spent years maintaining equipment in field conditions. "We are either growing or losing perspective on our duties. I am uncertain which. Can it be both?" Jaren pulled on the uniform, testing the repair. Maybe perspective is just growth wearing a different hat. His long-range scanner beeped then, a soft warning tone he'd learned to dread. He grabbed it, checking the readout. Azurian patrol signatures, still distant but moving in a search pattern that was methodically covering the region. The pattern had been getting tighter for the past week, concentric circles that would eventually, inevitably, include the temple ruins. "How long?" Sylvath asked, reading his expression. 3 days, maybe 4 if they get distracted." She looked at her legs, at the parallel bars she could barely use, at the body that was still remembering how to be whole. "I cannot run." "Then we don't run." Jaren set down the scanner and met her eyes. We figure something else out. That's what we've been doing for 2 months. No reason to stop now. The Azurian patrol arrived at dawn on the 4th day. 3 soldiers in full combat armor that made them look like they'd been carved from living sapphire and bad intentions. Jaren watched them through the gaps in the barricaded entrance, his scanner tracking their movements as they swept through the temple complex with equipment that would eventually find the chamber where he'd spent 2 months committing what both their militaries would definitely classify as treason. Sylveth stood beside him, leaning against the wall but actually standing, without support. She'd made remarkable progress in the past week, driven by the same ferocity she'd probably brought to combat before her spine got melted by plasma fire. She could walk now, could even manage a slow jog for short distances, though her endurance was still a fraction of what it had been. "I can go out," she said quietly. "Tell them I survived, that I was, recovering alone. And when they scan you and find 2 months' worth of human medical intervention, when they see the jury-rigged neural stimulator and the human plasma sutures." Jaren checked his weapon, making sure the charge pack was full. "They're going to have questions. Uncomfortable questions about why an Azurian officer has been receiving medical care from the enemy. Then I tell them you were my prisoner. With what restraints, what weapons pointed at me. I've been coming and going for weeks, Syl. They'll figure it out in about 30 seconds. He'd started calling her Syl around week 6, and she'd started allowing it around week 7, which he figured meant something about how far they'd traveled from being enemies who should have stayed enemies. The footsteps outside grew closer. Jaren could hear them speaking Azurian, the language musical even when discussing tactical sweeps and scanner readings. His translator implant gave him fragments, thermal signatures, structural integrity, report any survivors. Sylveth picked up a piece of rubble from the floor, a chunk of carved stone that had probably been part of some ancient alien's idea of profound architecture. She weighed it in her hand, testing the balance, and Jaren recognized the gesture. She was calculating trajectories, distances, making the mental preparations warriors made before everything went sideways. "You know," he said, watching her, "I've been thinking about Lieutenant Graves a lot lately. About that report I filed that went nowhere. About how the system protected him because the system doesn't actually care about doing the right thing. It cares about protecting itself. This is relevant now." "Yeah, actually it is." He moved away from the entrance, crossing to where she stood. "I spent a year thinking I'd failed, that I should have done more, pushed harder, made someone listen. But the truth is, the system was never going to listen. It was designed not to listen." The patrol was entering the temple proper now. Jaren could hear equipment powering up, scanners beginning their methodical sweep of the interior chambers. "Your commander shot you because you wouldn't murder civilians," Jaren continued. "My superiors buried my report because admitting Graves was wrong would mean admitting they promoted someone capable of that kind of wrong. We both learned the same lesson, that sometimes the people giving orders are worse than the enemy you're supposed to be fighting." A pessimistic conclusion. Maybe, or maybe it's just true and we've been fighting the wrong war this whole time. He looked at her, really looked at her. This Azurian warrior who'd spent 2 months learning to walk again, who'd taught him to breathe through nightmares, who'd laughed when she fell on him because falling meant progress. "You asked me once why I didn't leave you. I gave you some answer about being tired of protocol. That was true, but it wasn't complete." The footsteps were in the corridor now, maybe 20 meters from their barricaded chamber. "I didn't leave you because I was tired of being the kind of person who follows orders that make him less human. Because every time I tagged an enemy casualty and walked away, I lost a piece of something important. And I was running out of pieces." He smiled, though it felt sad around the edges. "Saving you, that was me saving myself, so thanks for that, I guess." Sylveth's hand found his, her blue fingers lacing through his human ones. "You are a disaster who makes terrible decisions." "Yeah, but they're my terrible decisions. I'm owning them. The scanner pulse hit their chamber, and Jaren felt it wash over them. That specific tingle of electromagnetic radiation mapping organic matter. The patrol would know now. 2 life signs, 1 human, 1 Azurian, together in a barricaded space. The kind of scenario that didn't fit any standard combat category. Contact, someone said outside, the translator rendering it in flat tones that couldn't capture the surprise in the speaker's voice. 2 signatures. One is, it matches Commander Sylvath's biological profile. There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant people were making rapid decisions about what to do with information that didn't make sense. Commander Sylvath, a voice called out in Azurian, amplified by suit speakers. Are you under duress? Signal if you require extraction. Sylvath looked at Jaren, those amber eyes holding a question. This was the moment. She could signal distress, could let them breach the chamber and eliminate him, could reclaim her old life minus the parts where her own people had tried to kill her. It would be the practical choice, the strategic choice, the choice that made sense if you were still playing by rules written by people who'd already betrayed you. I am not under duress, Sylvath called back, her voice strong, carrying the command authority she'd probably used to lead strike teams through plasma storms. I am exactly where I choose to be. More silence. Jaren could imagine the confusion on the other side of the barricade, the rapid consultations, the checking of protocols that definitely didn't cover this scenario. Commander, you're with a human combatant. Please clarify the situation. The situation, Sylvath said, and she was still holding Jaren's hand, still standing upright through sheer force of will, is that I was abandoned to die by our own forces for refusing an illegal order. This human refused to let me die alone. He has spent 2 months repairing what our people destroyed. So the situation is that I owe him a life debt that supersedes your authority, your orders, and your war. Jaren squeezed her hand. That was a really good speech, very dramatic. They're definitely going to shoot us now. Probably, but the shooting didn't come. Instead, there was more silence, longer this time. Then a different voice spoke, older, carrying more weight. Commander Sylvath, this is Captain Varesh. I was told you died honorably in combat. The official report. The official report is a lie, Sylvath interrupted. Commander Draxus ordered me executed for refusing to relay firing coordinates on a civilian target. I am alive because this human chose compassion over protocol, something our own forces failed to do. Even through the translator, Jaren could hear the shock in Captain Varesh's voice. These are serious accusations. These are facts, and I will testify to them before the Crystalline Council if I survive long enough to do so. Another pause. Jaren was starting to think pauses were the universal language of people realizing their entire worldview might need adjustment. Stand down, Captain Varesh ordered, though it wasn't clear if he was talking to his team or to them. Both of you were not breaching. Commander Sylvath, you're requested to return to Azure Prime to give testimony. The human. A longer pause. The human will be granted safe passage as your guest. Guest, Jaren whispered. Is that Azurian for prisoner we're being polite about? Probably, Sylvath whispered back. But it means they will not shoot you immediately, which is improvement. She was right. It wasn't perfect, wasn't even good, but it was better than the alternatives. And maybe that was all you could ask for sometimes, not victory, just survival with your principles relatively intact. We're coming out, Sylvath called. Slowly, no one do anything stupid. Speak for yourself, Jaren muttered, but he was already helping her toward the barricade. They emerged into morning light, Sylvath walking under her own power but accepting Jaren's support when her legs trembled. The 3 Azurian soldiers stared at them, and Jaren could see the moment they registered everything. The human medical equipment, the makeshift neural stimulator, 2 months' worth of survival against odds that should have been impossible. Captain Varesh stepped forward, his armor retracting to show a face that looked carved from blue stone and war stories. This is unprecedented. Yeah, I get that a lot, Jaren said. I'm great at making precedents, terrible at following them, excellent at creating them. And just like that, the war didn't end. Of course it didn't. Wars don't end because two people decided to be decent to each other in a temple on a dead planet. But something ended. The part of Jaren that thought following orders meant doing right. The part of Sylveth that believed her people were always honorable. Those versions of themselves died in that temple, and what walked out was different. Scarred maybe, uncertain definitely, but alive and together, and that felt like enough.